Hey guys, Mr. Talbot here for you. We're going to be diving into the interwar period between the world wars. So we're talking like the 1920s and into the 1930s a little bit. We're going to see what's going on. Going to zoom in a little bit on Russia, certainly on Germany, and also on Japan. So we're going to see some big changes in each of those places. Uh, when we see this time period, it's the interwar period. So obviously, this peace that is established is not going to last. So the guy in the top right here, Neville Chamberlain, is promising peace in our time. We're going to see that's not going to hold. And a big reason it doesn't hold is because this is a time period that is really going to be desperately calling out for American leadership. But the United States is going to kind of take a big step backwards towards isolationism, not going to be involved. And that's going to kind of leave a lot of our natural allies, people like France and England, vulnerable. And then when an economic depression hits, it's going to have a real big problem. So we're going to see these new totalitarian governments rise up. Excuse me. Anyways, so we want to back up a little bit into World War One. So if we think about what Russia's experience was, so Russia is, they're under the czars when the war starts. World War One's fascinating because people ride in on horses and they leave on tanks. But Russia was a big factor in the war going the way that it did because if we think back to the causes of it, with the assassination of the Archduke and all that stuff, that they're going to essentially rush to their Serbian allies' aid. Austro-Hungarian's going to not like that, and we're going to see this war expand out. Anyways, Russia has incredibly high casualties during this war because the Tsar's government was just very ineffective in outfitting and supporting the soldiers. On top of that, you've already got some beef with the Tsars going back before the war. You've got food shortages, and all this is going to lead to the Tsar's government's going to get overthrown, and these Bolsheviks or these communists are going to rise up. Now, the communists are going to get Russia out of the war. They're going to sign a treaty with Germany. Germany was happy to do it because they were running out of materials and resources, and they're going to think, man, if we could take all these soldiers from, who are fighting the Russians, that front, and move them all over against France and Britain, then we get the United States dives in World War One, and that kind of uh, brings back the stalemate and forces Germany eventually to surrender. Anyways, so what is communism? That's going to be the big effect in Russia. Not a ton of territory changing hands, a lot of casualties, but the big thing is a new type of government, that communist government put in place. This is where the government is going to make all economic choices. So you're not going to have the ability to choose your job, what you buy, all those consumer choices we're used to in the United States. Not going to see that. To make that happen, you got to have a very strong central government because again, they're making all the economic choices. And with a strong central government comes a loss of personal rights, personal liberties. So we're going to see that take place. And so again, remembering Germany had a two-front war, and so when Russia leaves, is able to focus more things in this area here. And so France has taken some pretty devastating effects too, but the United States is going to kind of come in and, prevent Germany from winning the war. But it's an incredibly damaging war for certainly the Germans, but especially the Russians. So if you look at this chart here, the Russians had about 12 million men go and fight in the war. The vast majority of them were either killed or wounded. Um, so incredible sacrifice that the Russians made, and incredibly unpopular for the Russian people, which is what leads to the Tsar being overthrown. The war in Germany, incredibly devastating. We see here, and we're going to see when Germany is forced to sign the surrender, there's going to be a lot of resentment at the government that did that. So what's interesting about Russia is that as soon as they kind of get out of World War One, they are then going to have a conflict among themselves and among some other neighbors, and it's going to be called the Russian Civil War. And essentially, it's a fight between those that want to be communists and those that don't. So you've got your Reds who want to be communists and your Whites who don't. They want to put some kind of old legislature or king back in power. Uh, England's actually going to send some people, and there's kind of some foreign influence and all. Don't need to know all that. Long story short, the Reds win, the Communists win. And in addition to being not just Russia, Russia's going to expand and win small conflicts in all the stands and places like Ukraine and stuff. They're going to put in their own communist governments, but all loyalty goes back to Moscow, it goes back to Russia. And this becomes the Soviet Union. Now, over the next 10 years, the Soviet Union, because of its massive size, all the resources, all the people, it's a big deal, literally and figuratively in the world. It's a big power player in the world. And the stated goal of the Soviet Union was to help workers around the world rise up in these communist revolutions. And this really terrifies people as far away as the United States, but certainly closer in places like Germany and in France. The idea that if the communists take over here, it's going to be a lot of loss of personal liberty, a lot of loss of personal freedom. So it's a big kind of warning thing that's going on in the interwar period is this rise of communism. So when World War I comes to an end, the Treaty of Versailles is signed, ending the fighting. Germany is going to lose a little bit of territory, but more importantly, Germany is going to be blamed for the war. There's a lot of people involved in why the war went the way they did. Certainly the Russians are partially to blame. Certainly you can say all those entangling alliances, those main causes we talked about before. Um, this is not what the U.S. president wanted. The U.S. president, who's Woodrow Wilson, said we should have peace without victory. But like, if you're the British and you're the French, you're like, hey, U.S., you showed up in the last 5 minutes. Yeah, you lost some people, but nothing compared to what we did. And we want the Germans to pay for it. They're the ones that we're going to blame. So there's that vengeance. And so Wilson's ideas are not going to be followed here. We're going to see breaking up of some empires, which we'll talk about more in our next unit. The U.S. has emerged as a global power. Again, they're not going to use their power. They're going to take that step backwards towards isolation, which is really not what the rest of the world's going to need. Germany's old form of government that kind of led to the war escalating the way that it did is going to be removed from power, and the Germans are going to try some democracy. It's not going to work out. Germany at this time didn't have any history of democracy. And the first thing this democracy has to do is to surrender. And so that makes the people of Germany not really like them very much. Then we're going to see this economic crisis hit at the same time this communism and socialism is rising. Germany's not going to be able to meet those needs, we'll see. But this global economic depression, which we in the United States know as the Great Depression, it affects the entire world. In fact, it affects a lot of the world more than it affected the United States. So a lot more issues of poverty, starvation, governments not meeting needs. And so this is going to set the scene for some totalitarian governments taking place. And again, because world history is fun, everything's happening simultaneously. We've also got radio and film are these new forms of media that are going to allow governments to more directly speak to their people. So as we look at these charts here, kind of just setting the scenes here, you're going to see the big winner with all these charts is the United States. So the United States is going to become more productive throughout World War I. You're going to see the United States have less inflation. Too much inflation is a bad thing. Germany is going to go off the charts here, where goods become more expensive, money becomes less valuable. Things get really, really bad in Germany. You see Britain is not a huge beneficiary, but they're not really hurt by the war. France and Germany and Italy are going to be kind of negatively affected by this war. We're going to see some upheaval in those areas. Britain less so because again they're less directly affected. So this new form of government is going to take place in totalitarianism. Similar in some ways to communism, where there's going to be a stronger central government and there's going to be more control over the economy, taking away of individual rights, that kind of thing. Single parties that have control. So in Germany, we see the Nazi party is the only one that really has political power. Certainly in the Soviet Union, it's just the Communist Party that has power. So it kind of starts in Italy, and this idea being, that we're going to support the people that are within our state, but we're going to be against everyone outside. This is that dark side of nationalism we were kind of hinting at before. But again, the government's going to have total control of the media. We'll see why that's important. But these governments become really, really oppressive. We're talking about people like Stalin. We're talking about people like Hitler. We're going to see later on the China and Mao Zedong. So really bad situation. So like, what could possibly make people want to go along with this? And the answer is essentially there's kind of three things we're going to see. First off, the old power structures, people are upset with the old power structures. You got us into this World War I. The cost and the casualties are, we've never seen anything like this before. And we're going to blame you for getting us into that conflict. We have this really upset generation that's, so there's just this anger at the old power structure, whether that's business interests in the United States, like we went and fought in this war because you lost some ships and some goods. That's crazy. The Germans are like, we had this, this government that signed this peace treaty, and we don't even like democracy. The French are real angry. I mean, just and obviously the Russians have already had their revolution by this point. So we're going to see governments changing hands in Germany, Russia, Italy, an increase in socialism in France and Britain. Democracy is just going to hang on by a thread in France, and we've seen the United States like we don't want to be involved with this war or with the rest of the world because that got us into this war. So the next thing is these governments are, whether they're old or new, kind of they're not responding to the challenges. So the casualties and the starvation led to this revolution in Russia. In Italy and in Spain, you're going to see the economic depression, failures of democracy, the threat of communism all leads to these fascist dictators being put in place, these totalitarian dictators. In Germany, they've got all of that. On top of it, though, they also have this thing called hyperinflation, where essentially Germany was forced to pay a lot of money for the war. Well, they just printed off a bunch of money to pay off this debt, and that caused their money to lose value at an incredible rate to the point where, as you see in the picture on the top right here, kids are playing with money. It was that lose that valuable. So as these totalitarian governments are coming to power, they've also now got these new toys in the media that they can use. So we're going to see that there's this control over what film is produced, what the news reports, what posters are made, all these things. The whole idea is to always push your state ideology. So the Nazis would push this idea of the ideal German, being that racial ethnic person you see there. In Japan, we're going to see that study that the United States is kind of evil. That's President Roosevelt they're portraying. Kind of wants to get its hands on everything. The other thing is with these new forms of media, each of these fascist states and all these totalitarian states have this charismatic leader that they can kind of use the media to promote, whether that's Stalin or Hitler. Essentially, since you're able to control the news and all the media, you're able to brainwash your population into kind of believing whatever you want. And again, we get into that dark side of nationalism where typically a minority group is going to be blamed for all of the nation's problems. That's particularly true with the Jews in Nazi Germany, are going to be blamed wrongfully for the problems that the German state was facing. The final thing is, these governments are rising up, but they're rising up in these places where things aren't good. So you would think, well, it shouldn't have worked as well. You would think the people wouldn't have gone along with it for as long as they did. Or like these stronger countries would have stepped in and said, no, don't do that. Again, but we see instead this idea of appeasement and this idea of, okay, in the case of Germany, we're going to let the German and Hitler expand Germany, as you see on the map here, into places like Czechoslovakia. We're going to let them remilitarize the frontier with France. We're going to let Germany take over Austria. And it's like, why would you let this crazy guy do that? But again, you got to put yourselves in their shoes. They've just come through World War I. They absolutely want to avoid another war. The United States is not going to come and help. Your country is frankly not ready for a war in France and England, so you definitely don't want to start a war now when you're not ready for it. So we let Hitler expand. We're going to let the Italian fascist leader Mussolini expand into Africa. We're going to let the Japanese expand, and we're not going to do anything about it because we want to avoid this war. We want to appease these leaders, hoping that they'll stop. Of course, we're going to see they're not going to stop. And so we're going to kind of close out here with looking at Japan, because when we think about World War II, Japan's actually going to be the one that kind of starts that fighting initially. So if you think back to Unit 4, with Japan, they were behind industrial-wise incredibly, but within 50 years, they're going to rapidly expand because of, government investment. And the economy is going great. They're going to start investing in their military. In the 1894, they're going to beat China in the war. 10 years later, they're going to beat the Russians in the war. And 10 years after that, they're going to get involved in World War I and take over some Pacific islands from the Germans. Victory after victory after victory for the Japanese military. The economy keeps growing, and then that global economic depression hits. People are going to blame the political leaders, but you're not going to blame the military because the military is all they've been doing is winning. So you turn to them. Well, the military leaders are going to say, let's invest more and more money into the military. As a result, Japan's going to be the first country to leave the Great Depression. And because you've just spent a bunch of money on your military, you might as well use it. And so they're going to start expanding first into China in the 1930s and eventually against the US and British in the 1940s, those raw materials, and World War II will begin.